Hello everybody, and welcome back to our discussion of selections, joins, and relates. We've talked about selections so far, about why you would want to do it, several ways that you would do it in general. You could do it by selecting, just clicking on the screen. You could use the Select by Attributes tool or the Select by Location tool. Well, now we're going to cover a topic called selection methods. These are what happens when you make that selection. And I'll tell you that as we discuss these, they're probably going to look really obvious and intuitive, and they are. They're pretty basic, but there are a few aspects of them that are a little tricky to get the hang of. Once you're used to them, they're second nature, but it might take a little practice to get used to them. All right, so let's look at them. Okay, first one is creating a new selection. In some places, this is referred to as select features from. They both mean the same thing. Next one is adding to a current selection. So if there's already some selected, you just make more things selected. You can remove from the current selection. You can select from the current selection, and you can switch the selection. So everything that was selected becomes unselected and vice versa. So we're going to look at how to do each of these. Now, all of these methods are available in both the Select by Attributes and the Select by Location tools. The trick is that they're named differently, and who knows why they did that. Probably just different programmers making each tool. But the thing to keep in your head is that both of them do the exact same methods, but they just name them differently. Okay, so first up, making a brand new selection. In the Select by Attributes tool, this is called Create a New Selection. Select by Location is called Select Features From. So it's just important to get those names down straight. The effect of this is pretty obvious and intuitive. You start with a bunch of features, you decide what you're going to select. A brand new selection makes those selected. Any existing selection that occurred before that is wiped clean, and it just starts with a new slate. Adding to a current selection takes whatever is previously selected and leaves them unchanged, and potentially will add new features to the selection set. Removing from the current selection just means you have a bunch of stuff selected, maybe some initial selection, and then you're just going to clear some of that out for some reason. So a secondary selection would just unselect what's currently selected. Selecting from the current selection just means to select a subset of what's currently there. And then there's switching the selection. And by the way, the two tools, the Select by Attributes and Select by Location, they don't have an option to switch selection. Switching selections is just such a basic function. It is provided in its own separate tool. You can get it in the layer by right-clicking the layer, go down to the Selection menu, and then choosing Switch Selection. You can also get it in any attribute table by just clicking the Switch Selection button up at the top. And what it does is about what you'd expect. Anything that is selected becomes unselected, and vice versa. There's also some selection methods when you are doing interactive selecting on the screen. Remember, if you just draw a circle on the screen, select all the roads that intersect it. Well, there are some selection methods available to you there as well. You get it in the Selection menu, go down to Interactive Selection Method, and there you can do Creating New or Add to Current, etc. Now, a quick note, how do you know how many features are selected? There are many homework questions and lab exercises, and many things you want to do in your career where you just need to know how many things are selected. So I want you to know where to find that number, and I'm also going to show you a place not to find that number. So the two best places to find out how many features are selected is open up the attribute table and look at the bottom. Alternatively, you can set the ArcMap table of contents sorting method to be list by selection, and that'll show you exactly how many features are selected in each feature class. Now, a quick note about attribute tables. Some of you may notice this, and this occurs most often with large attribute tables. You open it up and you look at the bottom to see how many features are there, and it says star 2000. So please understand that this doesn't mean that there's 2,000 records in the table. If there's a star 2000, that means that it has only loaded the first 2,000, and it doesn't even know how many records are in there. It does this to make it more responsive to you, so the table opens faster. If you want to know the true number of records that are in that table, you just have to click this little button here, and it takes you to the end of the table, and by doing so, it has to load the entire table. Once it's done that, it knows how many records are actually in there. Okay, now, This is where not to look for the number of selected records. So if you want to select how many cities are in Arizona, for example, don't look at this number in the bottom left corner of ArcMap. This is not reliable. This is the number of features selected from all layers that are currently in your map. And if you're just curious about the number of cities, this may not be the right number. In this image, for example, there are 113 features selected out of all the layers. Well, 3 of those are states. You can see Nevada, Utah, and Colorado selected, and then 110 of them are cities. So if you need a number of cities, then that 113 is 3 too high. And I wanted to mention this too before I forget. We looked at these selection options before when we were discussing spatial relationships when you draw on the screen. Well, this tool also lets you change that default cyan color if you want. So if you prefer a different color, if you want selected things to show up yellow, for example, here's where you can change it. Okay, now let's figure out how to actually use these cool selection methods. This topic covers selecting by multiple criteria, and this is really the more common way to do selections. Sometimes you want to know how many features meet some particular criteria, but more often than not, you have multiple criteria you care about. So this is an example I did several years ago. We had this grid of potential fishing areas off the coast of Morocco in northern Africa. We were trying to figure out which ones would be suitable for fishing if you were based in this port of ArcGIS. So in order to be suitable for fishing, it had to meet 3 criteria. First off, it had to be greater than a certain distance from shore. This was legislative criteria to keep fishing right out of the port itself. There was a fuel constraint. They couldn't go out too far from the port and still be able to make a living. So there was a maximum distance. And then there was a depth constraint. The fishing equipment would only fish at certain depth ranges. And based on those 3 criteria, these are the grid cells that were considered suitable for fishing. Now, selecting by multiple criteria is very common, probably more common than selecting by single criteria. Just got to get used to the rules. When you select by attributes, then you can build multiple criteria into a single SQL query. For example, you could give me all the cities that have a population greater than 1,000 and less than 2,000. This would give you all cities within that population range. It can get tricky when you have kind of complex logic. You start having to use a lot of parentheses to kind of separate the ands and ors and nots. But you can definitely build complex criteria into that SQL window. Now, when you're selecting by location, using that Select by Location tool, well, things are a little bit different. You can only do a single query at a time. There's just no way to build multiple criteria into that Select by Location tool. So you do several queries in a row, and you use different selection methods each time. So the first selection method is always make a brand new selection. This clears any selection that currently existed. Then each consecutive method will either add to that previous selection, subtract from it, select from it, or switch it. So that's selecting by location. Now sometimes you want to mix up the criteria. You want to select by both location and by attributes. Now you cannot do both at the same time, at least not in those tools. If you get into ArcGIS code, you can do it, but not in the standard tools that are available. They have to be done in separate steps. So as with selecting by location, you just do several queries in a row. Each time you do a different selection method. The first method is always make a brand new selection. And then you add to it, subtract from it, select from it, or switch it. So for example, this might be a basic single criteria selection. You're curious, you wonder where all the cities are that have a population greater than 100,000. Simple question. You pop it in the Select by Attributes tool. You quickly find out there's 264 cities across the country that meet that criteria. So great. But that's not usually the kind of question you want to ask. You usually want to be a little more specific. Maybe how many cities in Arizona have populations greater than 100,000. That turns into a multi-criteria query. And you have to select from different data sets to do that. So first you'd have to select the state of Arizona from the states feature class. Then you'd make an initial brand new selection on cities where the population is greater than 100,000. And then you do a select by location to select those cities that intersect Arizona. And you'd select just from the currently selected cities. You do this and you see that you have narrowed down your selection to just the 9 cities in Arizona that have greater than 100,000 people. So this is a much more interesting query, and the ability to do that makes you a much more useful GIS person too. All right, so some things to remember when you are selecting by multiple criteria. First, in a single SQL query, if you're doing this in the Select by Attributes window, each subquery must be a complete and workable query all by itself. So if you do multiple criteria, each criteria has to stand alone. So for example, if you want to select states of Arizona and New Mexico, you'd have to have a full query, state name equals Arizona, or another full query, state name equals New Mexico. This will be a correct SQL query. This is not correct. State name equals Arizona or New Mexico. Now this, you might notice, the second option generally makes more logical sense to people. I want Arizona or New Mexico. But the computer just doesn't read it that way. You have to structure your query in the way the computer can understand. And this particular error is really common. Actually, the good thing about this particular error is that it raises an error. It will crash. That way you know you did it wrong. Let's look at another mistake that won't raise an error. When you try to select more than one attribute value from a single attribute field and you use the AND operator. So, for example, if you want to select both Arizona and New Mexico, in human thought, we would want to do state name equals Arizona and state name equals New Mexico. But this won't give you the result you want. Is there any single state that is named both Arizona and New Mexico? No, states only have a single name. If you look closely at this query, it's asking for a state that has two names. Problem is this will not trigger an error, but it'll always give you 0 results. So it's kind of subtle and sneaky, and you might do it and don't even know you did it, and not until later, and you're just not getting the output you thought you'd get. So you just got to learn the language. Now, next thing to remember is take advantage of the fact that you have a GIS and it's making maps for you, and you can look at the results of your queries really quick. So in this example, I'm wanting to select all these points that meet 2 criteria. I want to select all the points that are in this management stand boundary, and I also want those points to be within 100 meters of the road. So if you look at this map, look at this selection, can you spot that there is an obvious error? Well, this is what having a map handy can do for you. You can see right off that there's a bunch of points selected outside the polygon, and so you can fix it. So sometimes people forget to just look at the map. They forget to look at the results of their queries. They just sort of stumble along, and the error never gets figured out, and so the error propagates it through their whole analysis. So just be careful of that. Next topic, we've been discussing selections. Now let's move on to table joins. To join 2 tables means to create a connection between those tables such that the attribute values from one table or feature class become directly available in another table or feature class. So this is especially useful when there are many records that have the same attribute value, like maybe there's a code for a forest stand type, and another table has extensive data on each stand type. So putting the extensive data in a separate table lets you avoid repeating that data over and over in the first table. So this type of relationship is good for one-to-one and many-to-one relationships. And there's a similar concept called a relate that's good for one-to-many and many-to-many relationships. And we'll talk about that in just a sec. So, for example, this is a scenario that is crying out for a join. We have a polygon feature class with very little data in the attribute table. And notice this polygon feature class has a very large number of records. And we can use the identify command, and we click on a spot and we learn very little about it. We find out that it has grid code 3159, and that's about it. But we also have a table that's just filled with great information about each vegetation class, but which has no spatial objects telling us where that information occurs on the ground. But notice that this table only has 91 records. This means there's only 91 vegetation types that exist on the Coconino National Forest out of those 750,000 polygons. Here's a question. Can you see the logic in putting these 91 records in a separate table? We can either record these vegetation records 91 times in this single table, or we can do it 750,000 times in the full polygon feature class. That first option uses much less space on your hard drive, but it does require that you have some means to connect the polygons to this table. Now here we see that there's lots of polygons that may correspond with a single table record, and this is what I mean by a many-to-one relationship. Many polygons corresponding with one record. Joins also work with one-to-one relationships where there's only one polygon that connects with that record. So joins work just fine for many-to-one relationships. Here we're joining the table to the polygon feature class, and essentially we have added a bunch of new attribute fields to the polygon attribute table. And we open the table, we see all the fields from both tables. Now, important thing to remember is neither the polygon feature class nor the attribute table has been modified on the hard drive in any way. The data are undisturbed. This join relationship occurs entirely in the computer memory and only exists as long as the ArcMap document's open. We can make use of it, so now that we click on a point, we can see all the joined attribute data as well. We see that this still has a value or a grid code of 3159, but we see all the extra attributes that are part of that 3159 class. In particular, this is Rocky Mountain Montane, Riparian, Forest, and Woodland. According to other vegetation classification systems, it's considered riparian, it's considered western riparian, woodland, and shrubland, etc. Now, the last topic for today's lecture is relates and relationship classes. These are conceptually similar to joins in that you link tables together. This allows you to get information on a feature by pulling data from different tables. However, they are different than joins, and the linked tables are not merged together. If you open a table that participates in a relate or a relationship class, it won't look any different than it would if it were not participating. Now, relates and relationship classes are good for one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, and many-to-many relationships. Now, what's the difference? Relates and relationship classes are almost identical to each other. They both define the same types of relationships between tables and feature classes, and you use them exactly the same way. The difference between them is that relates are created in memory in ArcMap, while relationship classes are saved into a geodatabase. You create a relate while you're within your current ArcMap session, and you can only use it while you're working within that particular ArcMap document. Relationship classes, on the other hand, are permanently saved to a database until you deliberately choose to delete them, and they're accessible at any time from any ArcMap or ArcGIS Pro session. Another difference is that you can create relates using any license level of ArcMap, but to create a relationship class, you need at least a standard or advanced license. Now, what can you do with them? One of the cool things is that the Identify tool can take advantage of relates. If your feature class has any relates or relationship classes, then you can see all related features and records when you click on that feature. So in this example, we're clicking on this spring here. We can see the attributes for the spring itself, but then we see all these related tables that are connected up, and we can get all the data from any one of them. Another cool thing is that you can push selections from one data set to another. In this example, we're curious about what invertebrate species have ever been observed on springs in the southern part of the Coconino National Forest. So we can select the springs we care about, and in this example we can see that we have 36 springs selected. Well, we can push that selection to the surveys that have ever been done, and we can see that there are 87 surveys that have ever been performed on these 36 springs. Then we can push the selection from the surveys table to the invert sampling table, and that tells us that there's 650 times some invertebrate has ever been recorded on one of those 87 surveys. Then we can push that selection one more time to the taxa invert table, and this tells us that there's 185 unique invertebrate species that have ever been observed on those springs. Now let me show you a quick demo of using these relates and relationship classes. This is on a database of springs that you have in your data folder. So let's try a couple of things. First off, let's find out what one particular spring called Chimney Spring, what does it look like? So I happen to know that Chimney Spring has a site ID value of 802. So I do a select by attributes where site ID equals 802. Okay, we have that one spring selected. It appeared right up here. We'll zoom into that spot. Now, I can use the Identify tool here to click on that spring. Here's the information that is in the Springs Feature Class attribute table. All of these attributes are right in the data set itself. Now, here we have a plus sign. This is unusual. The plus sign means that there are related tables. So I can open that up. I can see that here's a table of surveys. I can open that up. I can see that there are 4 surveys that have ever been performed on this spring. I can scroll around in here. For each survey, I can find additional information that has been gathered on it. So in this particular one, on Survey 174, performed on August the 8th of 2010, looks like they have some images from that survey. I can open that up and see that there are 3 images available. Anytime you see these lightning bolts, that means that it's a hyperlink and you can click on it. And here we go. It looks like somebody drew a sketch map of this spring back on that survey. We can click on one of these others. This is a representative image. This is an additional image. Let's look at the representative image. Photograph of the spring. Now these images are not stored in the database itself. These are all stored online, and the Identify tool is able to link to it and open it in a browser. So this is how we can make a simple use of the relationship classes. Now let's try a more complicated one. Suppose we want to identify what vertebrate species have ever been observed at springs on the Mormon Lake District. Well, there are several tables to traverse to get to this information, and you have a lab exercise that's going to walk you through how to do it. But let me demonstrate it really quick. First off, we're curious about vertebrate species on the Mormon Lake District. So first we select all those springs that are on the Mormon Lake District. Again, it's a select by attributes. In this case, the proper query string would be land unit detail equals Coconino National Forest Mormon Lake Ranger District. Hit apply. There's 80 springs that have been selected on that district. We can zoom to them, and here are the springs on the Mormon Lake District. All right. Now, our question is what vertebrate species occur. Well, I happen to know that this is linked through several tables. I use this table, the related tables, to push the selection from the springs to the surveys. I quickly find out that there's 174 surveys that have been performed on those springs. Now I push this selection from surveys to vert survey table. Click on that. I find that there are 217 vertebrate species that have ever been observed. Well, actually 217 vertebrate observations that have ever been recorded on any of those surveys. Now what species were they? We push it one more time to the tax-avert table. This tells us that 77 unique vertebrate species have ever been observed, and these are them. So we push the selection through a series of 4 data sets, and now we have a selection of vertebrate species that have ever been observed out there. Okay, you can do this in reverse as well. Suppose I want to know what springs western tanagers have ever been observed at, and who wouldn't? Western tanagers are just beautiful birds. So I can select it in the tax-avert table. I have one species selected. I can push it to the vert surveys table to find out how many times western tanager has ever been observed and recorded. So we push it to vert survey. We see that there are 9 cases where that species has been observed. Well, how many surveys has it been observed? We push it one more time to the surveys table. There are 9 surveys that it's ever been observed at. Now, where are they? So we push this selection one last time to the springs feature class, and we see there are 9 springs that it has ever been observed on. We can zoom to that selection, and the cyan ones are the ones that have had western tanagers. So that's all there is to it. Now, this geodatabase is actually pretty cool. It makes better use of relationship classes than any data set I'm aware of. So I've got you a copy of it. And we also have presented this geodatabase at conferences here and there. And so I've got a copy of one of our presentations for you to look over. It'll give you a better introduction into the geodatabase itself. So go ahead and take a look at that once you're done with this lecture. All right, and thanks so much. I appreciate your time, and let's get on to the labs.